If ancient people avoided danger, then why do their most enigmatic structures appear in the most dangerous places, perched above canyons, balanced on narrow ridges, scattered across summits where storms gather first? What compelled them to climb so high just to leave subtle circles and lines of rock? Were these places chosen for what they overlooked, or for what overlooked them? And if these mountaintop structures were not built for shelter, storage, or survival, then what purpose demanded these heights? Every stone seems to ask a question that has never been fully answered. Teton enclosure. High on a wind-carved spur of the Teton range, where the granite shoulders of the mountains lean into a sky thinned by altitude and silence, the structure known as the Teton enclosure settles into the landscape with a restraint that makes it easy to miss, yet difficult to forget once seen, its low stone alignments forming an irregular ring against the tundra, as if shaped by long patience rather than force, offering the first suggestion that people once climbed to this improbable height with intentions that exceeded mere passage. The approach reveals little at first, only scattered boulders and the persistent combing of alpine winds, but the geometry begins to appear as one moves among the rocks, a faint but deliberate arrangement that introduces a quiet question about the purpose of building so far above the valleys where daily subsistence would have been more predictable. Archaeologists have noted that the stones do not match the chaotic scatter left by natural frost heave, and their placement, though subtle, follows patterns seen in high-altitude vision quest sites throughout the northern Rockies, lending an early sense that ritual activity may have shaped this ridge over centuries. Yet the evidence remains light, composed of arrangements rather than artifacts, and the site's elevation above 10,000 feet complicates interpretation because seasonal snowpack, lightning strikes and shifting freeze-thaw cycles erase the small traces that might otherwise anchor the story. What persists is the relationship between the enclosure and the horizon. Its opening faces west, toward the plain where the Snake River braids and rebraids through the basin, and the vantage commands a view that broadens into Wyoming's long distances, an observation point as much as a destination, suggesting that the sky and the line of the mountains may have been as significant as the stones themselves. Some have proposed that the enclosure possibly functioned as a lookout or a hunting aid, but the height and exposure argue against long-term occupation, and the lack of hearths or domestic debris keeps such ideas tentative. Others note the cultural patterns among ancestral Shoshone groups, whose high mountain practices often involved solitary time spent in austere, elevated places, using the ridgelines as thresholds where individuals sought guidance. And while this association remains cautious, it frames the enclosure in a broader regional tradition that gives its seclusion a meaningful context. Geological surveys have examined whether the stones could have been relocated by older glacial activity or natural slides, yet the consistent size of the rocks and the enclosure's gentle arcs do not align with such processes, leaving intentional human placement the simplest explanation. Still, the exact period of construction remains uncertain. Lichen growth patterns hint at significant age, possibly centuries, but radiocarbon opportunities are scarce in a landscape dominated by rock and wind. When mapped carefully, the structure reveals a slight discrepancy in alignment. Its long axis is not quite perpendicular to the ridge, nor does it perfectly mirror any solstice line. Yet the near coincidences raise the question of whether the builders sought celestial markers loosely rather than precisely, allowing natural features to guide orientation instead of strict astronomical geometry. This ambiguity deepens when comparing the site to other high-altitude settings in the region, some of which exhibit clearer relationships to sunrise positions or mountain peaks that hold cultural significance. The Teton enclosure sits close enough to these patterns to invite comparison but distant enough to resist confident categorization. Its interior shows no signs of excavation pits or food preparation areas, but the protected nook created by the ring could have sheltered a person briefly from the prevailing winds, a modest refuge that suggests focused short-duration activity rather than communal ceremonies. Even so, the effort required to reach this ridge, ascending thousands of vertical feet, negotiating steep talus, and carrying knowledge of a specific destination, implies that those who used it did so with intent rather than chance wandering. During modern surveys, researchers have noted how the enclosure frames distant features at particular times of day. The crest of the southern Tetons catches late summer light in a way that briefly illuminates a single band of cliffs, while storms moving across the basin approach in long, slanting curtains visible hours before they arrive. These observations highlight how the site functions not only as a physical space, but as a vantage woven into cycles of weather, season, and light. And although there is no proof that ancient visitors perceived the same interplay, the possibility adds a quiet dimension. Yet contradictions persist. Some stones appear tumbled, others seem lightly reset as if rearranged in later periods, and the lack of diagnostic tools or ceramics prevents tying the enclosure to any specific cultural phase. A few researchers have suggested that the structure may have seen intermittent use by different groups over long spans of time, each interpreting the ridge according to its own customs, leading to a palimpsest of intentions that now blur together. Such layered histories would explain the inconsistencies in alignment and form, though the idea remains speculative because the evidence is diffuse. What remains constant is the enclosure's position on the mountain itself, anchored to a shoulder that collects thunderheads in summer and sculpted drifts in winter, a place where ecological boundaries tighten and human presence becomes more deliberate. Standing within it, one notices how the wind drops slightly, how the ground levels just enough to sit or kneel, and how the surrounding peaks form a natural amphitheatre of stone and silence. Conditions that may have carried meaning long before the modern trail systems approached the range. The absence of definitive answers has become part of the site's quiet identity, not through exaggeration, but through the simple limits imposed by altitude, time, and minimal disturbance. The stones neither confirm nor deny ceremony, observatory use, or personal isolation. Instead, they settle into an intermediate space where multiple interpretations fit loosely without locking into certainty, allowing the enclosure to remain what it has long been. A high, solitary structure shaped by human hands, yet still inseparable from the mountain's broader geology. And as each new survey refines measurements or notes subtle shifts, the enclosure continues to offer its careful reserve, suggesting that whatever purpose once guided its builders was carried more in experience than in architecture, leaving a form that endures mainly because it holds its questions as steadily as its stones. Mesa Verde Sun Temple. On the sun-washed mesa top above Cliff Palace, where the sandstone rim opens into a broad wind-slow plateau, the structure known as the Sun Temple rises not through height but through geometry, its D-shaped footprint and thick masonry walls forming a deliberate contrast to the cliff dwellings tucked beneath the alcoves below, as though its builders sought a vantage that engaged the sky more directly than daily life allowed, leaving behind a plan so symmetrical and carefully laid that the intention behind it feels both evident and elusive at the same time. The approach across the mesa is gentle, yet the temple reveals itself gradually, its masonry blocks fitted with a precision that reflects the architectural confidence of late Pueblo III communities, suggesting that the people who constructed it around the late 12th or early 13th century did so during a period when cooperative building projects still held strong communal meaning. Archaeologists have long noted that, unlike domestic structures, the Sun Temple shows no signs of habitation, no hearths, no refuse, no storage pits, only formal walls rising to what may once have been shoulder height or higher, arranged around a central open court whose orientation offers its first quiet hint of a relationship with the surrounding horizon. To the east, the skyline breaks around the notched silhouettes of the La Plata Mountains. To the west, the Mesa falls away into rolling pinon juniper country where the light stretches toward evening. And within this broad compass, many have found alignments that loosely coincide with solstice sunrise and sunset positions, subtle enough to invite consideration, but not precise enough to claim with certainty. The twin circular rooms, set into the D-shaped perimeter, often called towers, deepen the intrigue, their thick walls and elevated doorways hinting at roles that exceed domestic needs, yet lacking the clear astronomical slots or apertures found at more explicit observation sites across the southwest. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed carefully pecked stone surfaces and embedded features that may have supported wooden elements, perhaps raising platforms, screens, or internal partitions whose purpose remains unknown now that only the stone footprints survive. At the same time, the temple's masonry, double-coursed with a rubble core, resembles the finest construction at nearby Sun Point and Oak Tree House, reinforcing the idea that the builders assembled here during a moment of social investment, channeling skilled labour into a structure that shows no practical function beyond gathering, witnessing, or marking. Yet contradictions accompany every interpretation. The alignments appear suggestive, but not definitive. The layout evokes planning, but obscures the intended activities, and while the site's elevated position offers clear vantage lines to key horizon features, its walls lack the narrow, sight-bearing apertures that would confirm dedicated astronomical use. Some researchers propose that the temple may have served as a ceremonial open space linked to agricultural cycles, its presence on the mesa top symbolically overseeing the cliff dwellings below. But the absence of kivas, central to ritual life in the region, complicates this view, suggesting either a distinct function or an architectural departure at the very end of occupation. Others suggest that the temple might have been an unfinished project, with construction ceasing before roofing, plastering, or interior features could be added, perhaps due to shifting population dynamics as drought and social stresses intensified across the 13th century. However, the uniformity and completeness of the existing masonry challenge the idea of abandonment mid-build. Geological studies of the mesa surface reveal that the temple sits on a stable sandstone capstone, safe from the alcove-forming erosional processes below. A foundation choice that emphasizes intentional siting rather than convenience, implying that its builders selected this location for visibility, durability, or symbolic elevation. When remapped using modern instruments, the site shows a slight difference in angle between its long axis and the cardinal directions, a deviation that neither dismisses nor confirms solar intent, but raises the possibility that the temple may have been keyed to local horizon points rather than astronomical azimuths alone. Recent ground surveys have noted how, at certain times of year, the distant peaks around the La Plata range receive the first light in a way that aligns with sight lines from the temple's central court, though whether this relationship held meaning for its builders remains speculative. The structure's lack of roof, falls, or debris complicates. Reconstructions of its height, yet the preserved wall faces exhibit pecked and smoothed surfaces that speak to a level of finish often associated with communal or ceremonial contexts rather than household spaces. Still, the greatest uncertainty rests in the fact that no direct artifacts, ceramic clusters, ritual objects, or agricultural tools anchor the function. The temple remains defined by absence as much as by presence, a stone outline that conveys intention without revealing it. Unlike the cliff dwellings below, which preserve domestic rhythms in hearth ash, storage jars and plastered rooms, the Sun Temple holds only the echo of gatherings that left little trace. And this sparseness complicates attempts to situate the structure within the broader cultural transitions occurring across the region. Some hypotheses suggest that the temple may have been used briefly or intermittently, or perhaps only for a single generation before larger social and environmental pressures led communities to migrate southward. If so, the limited archaeological signature would not be surprising, and yet the symmetry of the layout, the balanced relationship between its circular and rectilinear forms, and the care invested in its construction, imply that whatever took place here mattered deeply at the time, even if the practices have slipped outside the surviving record. The surrounding Mesa top, dotted with smaller structures and ancient roads traced faintly into the sandstone, adds further texture to the mystery, for the temple sits near the terminus of several regional pathways, suggesting a nodal point in movement patterns that may have brought multiple groups together. But just as these pathways converge, so do the uncertainties, for the temple remains a structure that gestures simultaneously toward observation, ceremony, gathering, and the marking of seasonal thresholds without fully confirming any single purpose. In this balance of evidence and ambiguity, the Sun Temple continues to hold its quiet place on the Mesa, a geometric imprint shaped by hands that sought meaning in stone and light, leaving behind a form that endures precisely because it refuses to speak too clearly, allowing the structure to rest in that narrow space where architectural certainty fades into the broader open landscape of questions. Bighorn Medicine Wheel. Near the summit of Medicine Mountain in northern Wyoming, where the ridgeline narrows into a high limestone spine shaped by wind, ice, and long winters, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel rests with a quiet steadiness that belies its altitude, its 80-foot ring of pale stones stretched across the thin alpine turf, as though anchored to the mountain, not by weight, but by intention. The 28 spokes radiating from a central cairn in a pattern both unmistakably deliberate and yet softly irregular, shaped by centuries of exposure and generations of hands that may have altered it in ways now difficult to trace. Approaching the wheel on foot, the air thins and the horizon expands into sweeping views of the Bighorn Basin on one side and the rising Absarokas on the other. And this openness gives the structure an immediate relationship with sky and distance that encourages reflection even before the stones come clearly into view. Archaeological surveys suggest its construction reached its present form several centuries ago, though some elements, particularly the central cairn, may possess deeper origins, and the layering of use across time complicates attempts to attach the wheel to a single moment or cultural phase. The orientation of several cairns, with notable solar and stellar events, has long drawn attention, especially the alignments marking the summer solstice sunrise and sunset, and a series of sightlines that may connect to the heliacal rising of certain stars important in plains astronomy. Yet while these correspondences appear suggestive, they remain grounded more in pattern recognition than in explicit archaeological markers, and scholars continue to treat them with measured caution. The idea that the wheel functioned as an observatory in a strict architectural sense is tempered by the irregularities in its spokes, the drift and shifting of stones over time, and the possibility that its alignments may have been symbolic rather than mathematically precise, reflecting knowledge of the sky expressed through ritual structures rather than formal astronomical instruments. Ethnographic connections to several northern plains tribes, most notably the Crow, who maintain cultural ties to the mountain, add layers of meaning, but also highlight the complexities of continuity. For while oral histories affirm the spiritual significance of high places and circular forms, they do not definitively identify the wheel's original builders, suggesting a long tradition of shared landscapes where meanings evolved across generations. At the same time, Studies of the wheel's material composition show no unique quarrying or specialized shaping. The stones are local, collected from the immediate vicinity, yet arranged in a pattern that distinguishes them clearly from natural scatter, a pattern maintained across centuries despite the challenges of snow load, frost heave, and seasonal storms that rearrange loose material on exposed ridges. Some researchers have noted the absence of artifacts within the wheel's interior, no tools, pottery, or food remnants, underscoring the idea that it was not a habitation site, but rather a place for periodic gathering or solitary observance, with activity focused more on experience than on leaving physical traces. The 28 spokes have invited interpretations ranging from lunar symbolism to social or ceremonial structuring, but their slight asymmetry complicates these readings, reminding observers that the wheel may have been constructed incrementally or adjusted through time, each modification reflecting specific needs or interpretations later obscured by erosion and reconfiguration. The 6 peripheral cairns, positioned around the wheel's circumference, add another layer of subtle intrigue as their arrangement interacts with sightlines toward distant peaks and horizon dips, though the significance of these visual relationships remains uncertain, shaped partly by modern attempts to decode alignments that may have held different meanings in their original context. Geological surveys of Medicine Mountain show that its summit ridge has shifted only slowly over millennia, providing a stable platform for the wheel. Yet the constant scouring of winter winds has likely moved smaller stones repeatedly, leaving archaeologists cautious about relying too heavily on precise positional data when reconstructing older alignments. This combination of stability and change, large cairns anchoring the form, while smaller stones migrate, creates a landscape where intention and natural processes intertwine, shaping a structure both fixed and fluid. Some hypotheses propose that the wheel served as a place of preparation or transition for young individuals undertaking vision quests, its position near the summit offering solitude and an unbroken arc of sky that aligns with known practices across the plains. But the absence of direct archaeological signatures keeps such ideas within the bounds of informed possibility rather than confirmation. Others point to the wheel's panoramic setting, where weather systems sweep across the basins in long advancing shadows, and lightning storms rise abruptly from the west, suggesting that the mountain itself, rather than the stones alone, may have been the primary focus, the wheel acting as a marker within a larger experiential landscape. The structure's endurance owes as much to cultural respect as to geology. Historic accounts describe native visitors maintaining the wheel, resetting stones, or adding small offerings, actions that reflect continuity of meaning even as specific practices shift. This continuity adds complexity for researchers seeking to distinguish original forms from later modifications, though it also highlights the wheel's ongoing relevance in ways that transcend strictly archaeological interpretation. When mapped today, the pattern holds together with a coherence that implies purpose, but not precision, a balance that resists both overstatement and dismissal, allowing the wheel to function simultaneously as a cultural landmark, a historical artifact, and a landscape feature shaped by ritual presence. As with many high-altitude structures, the wheel offers a blend of evidence and uncertainty, enough architectural clarity to confirm human design, enough environmental wear to obscure chronological details, and enough cultural depth to suggest layered meanings spanning multiple groups. In this interplay between stone and sky, the medicine wheel remains neither an unsolved puzzle nor a fully comprehended monument. Instead, it stands in that enduring threshold where intentionality and ambiguity coexist, its spokes reaching outward like quiet reminders of long-observed cycles, its ring holding steady against shifting seasons, and its mountain setting carrying the larger mystery of how people across time have engaged with heights that draw the eye outward and inward at once. Chimney Rock Observatory. high on a narrow ridge above the Piedra River Valley in southern Colorado, where the land lifts suddenly into steep-sided spines of weathered sandstone. The site known as Chimney Rock Observatory occupies a perch so sharply defined that the sky seems to meet the ground at the edge of every step. Its cluster of masonry rooms and low walls arranged along the crest that leads toward the twin pinnacles rising beyond, those pillars of stone that have shaped both the site's identity and its enduring mystery. Approaching along the ridge, the structures appear modest at first, mostly foundations of Chacoan-style rooms built in the 11th century. But the alignment of the great house with the gap between the two rock towers begins to emerge as one climbs, that subtle directional pull, inviting attention toward a relationship between architecture and horizon that researchers have examined for decades. The most prominent suggestion centers on the lunar standstill cycle, the rare moment every 18.6 years when the moon rises or sets at its northernmost or southernmost extreme. And observers have noted that from the Great House, the moon appears between the twin spires in a way that aligns with this predictable but infrequent event. Yet, even as the alignment seems compelling, archaeologists approach the interpretation carefully, acknowledging uncertainties in ancient sightlines, vegetation patterns, and potential structural heights that might have altered the view. The buildings themselves reflect Chacoan masonry traditions, core and veneer walls, carefully shaped sandstone blocks, and room forms consistent with regional great houses, suggesting that the site was integrated into the broader Chacoan world, though its extreme elevation and exposed ridgetop setting distinguish it from the monumental centers at the heart of the San Juan Basin. Excavations have uncovered hearths, grinding stones, and domestic debris that indicate intermittent habitation, but not the sustained occupation seen in larger settlements, supporting the idea that Chimney Rock may have served as a seasonal or event-based gathering location rather than a village. Geological studies of the ridge highlight its natural alignment with the surrounding landscape. The twin towers themselves stand as erosional remnants formed from more resistant sandstone layers, their narrow gap and symmetrical rise, offering a striking visual focus long before any structures were built. Some researchers suggest that ancient builders may have used this unique feature as a natural marker, designing the architecture to incorporate or emphasize its visual prominence, though the extent to which the Great House was oriented specifically for astronomical observation remains a question approached with measured restraint. Several other architectural features, such as low kivas and ancillary rooms, show no clear astronomical purpose, and the absence of narrow sighting windows or engineered apertures tempers the idea of a dedicated observatory in the modern sense. Still, the ridge's vantage is undeniable. From the site, the San Juan Mountains lift in the distance, the Piedra Valley falls away sharply, and the spires punctuate a skyline that offers a clean stage for horizon events, making it reasonable to consider that sky watching played some role in the site's use. The construction period, clustered around the early 11th century, coincides with a time of expanding Chacoan influence, and the site's location near the far northeastern edge of the Chacoan sphere suggests an outpost or satellite community positioned to engage with both local groups and distant centers. Yet contradictions persist. While the lunar standstill alignment appears striking, the uncertainties in reconstructed architectural height raise the possibility that the view between the spires may not have been as controlled or narrow as it seems today, leaving room for hypotheses that focus more on symbolic or experiential relationships with the ridge than on precise astronomical measurement. Moreover, the domestic debris discovered on site suggests that people lived here long enough to cook, store food, and perform routine tasks, activities that may have been linked to broader ceremonial gatherings rather than solely to lunar observation. Ethnographic parallels among Pueblo communities indicate that high places and distinctive rock formations often carry layered meanings, combining social, ceremonial, and cosmological functions. And this broader framework helps situate Chimney Rock within a landscape where astronomy, symbolism, and community interaction might have been intertwined rather than separated. Some researchers emphasize that the ridge itself offers views of multiple horizon points, where the sun and moon rise or set throughout the year, suggesting a more general observational purpose rather than a focus solely on the lunar standstill. Others note that the site's relative isolation, combined with its Chacoan architectural traits, may reflect a strategic or symbolic assertion of presence on the landscape's northern frontier, though such interpretations remain cautious, given the lack of direct evidence for political or administrative functions. Surveys of the surrounding slopes have revealed additional structures, small rooms, middens, and pathways that hint at a community larger than the ridgetop buildings alone. Yet the intensity of occupation appears episodic, as though use of the site surged during certain seasons or events and quieted during others. This intermittent pattern resonates with the idea of gatherings keyed to astronomical cycles, but the archaeological record remains thin enough that other seasonal activities, hunting, trade interactions, or ritual gatherings unrelated to lunar events cannot be excluded. The pinnacles themselves, nearly 300 feet tall, cast shifting shadows across the ridge as the sun moves, and their presence shapes the sensory experience of the site in ways that are difficult to quantify archaeologically, but likely significant. Whether used as markers, symbols, or companions to ceremony, the spires form a natural axis around which the great house seems subtly oriented, though not with the strict precision found in some other southwestern sites. And just as the alignments invite interpretation, so do the absences. No elaborate carved features, no fixed sighting channels, no inscriptions or artifacts explicitly tying the architecture to a specific ritual. What remains instead is a pattern of possibilities supported by architecture, geography, and horizon lines, but moderated by the limits of preservation, erosion, and shifting light across centuries. In this interplay of potential intention and partial evidence, Chimney Rock Observatory continues to hold its quiet position on the ridge, a meeting point of stone towers, Chacoan walls, and open sky, where the patterns of the moon, the rhythms of seasonal occupation, and the deep history of the surrounding mountains might have converged into meanings now only partially visible. And as each new survey refines measurements or redraws the relationships between architecture and landscape, the site maintains a balance between clarity and uncertainty, offering enough structure to suggest purpose, but enough ambiguity to let the twin spires and the ridge itself remain central to the enduring mystery that rises with them. Pueblo Alto. On the northern rim of Chaco Canyon, where the mesa edge tilts gently toward the open desert and the wind moves unbroken across a plain of sandstone and scattered juniper, the great house known as Pueblo Alto sits with a restrained but unmistakable presence, its masonry outlines forming a low constellation of rooms and courtyards arranged along the narrow shelf that overlooks the canyon below. A position that offers both isolation and command, as though chosen to observe the rhythms of the valley from a deliberate remove. The structure's form reflects the architectural logic of late 9th and 10th century Chaco, with core and veneer walls, carefully shaped sandstone blocks, and geometric planning that aligns its rooms and plazas in a pattern both orderly and responsive to the uneven mesa surface. Yet, unlike the monumental complexes of the canyon floor, Pueblo Bonito and Quetzalcoatl among them, Pueblo Alto stands apart on high ground, its elevation granting a wide horizon that stretches toward distant mesas and lowlands, a vantage that has long led researchers to consider how visibility, movement, and regional connection may have shaped its purpose. Excavations reveal that Pueblo Alto functioned not as an isolated dwelling but as a node in the broader Chacuan system, linking outlying communities through a network of ancient roadways that converge near the mesa's flank. Their straight segments cutting across the desert with a precision that speaks to careful planning rather than casual travel. The proximity of these roads to Pueblo Alto suggests that it may have played a role in managing movement or exchange, though the extent of such activities remains difficult to quantify, as the archaeological record contains only fragments of tools, ceramics, and animal bone rather than overt markers of administration or trade. The site's middens, however, contain unusually high concentrations of pottery sherds, some locally produced and others originating from distant regions, implying episodes of gathering or redistribution, though whether these reflect ceremonial feasts, seasonal assembly, or intermittent trade remains open to interpretation. The architecture offers further subtleties. The great house's linear layout along the mesa rim creates sightlines that connect with other high points across the region, and some researchers propose that these visual links may have facilitated communication or acted as symbolic relationships aligned with the larger Chacuan landscape, though direct evidence for signaling or coordinated observation is lacking. At the same time, the absence of large kivas within Pueblo Alto raises questions about its ceremonial role. The few smaller subterranean rooms do not match the scale or architectural elaboration seen in the canyon's monumental kivas, suggesting that if ritual activities occurred here, they may have differed in form or emphasis. Geological surveys of the mesa reveal that its edges erode slowly but steadily, and the exposed position of Pueblo Alto has left its walls more weathered than those protected in the canyon below, adding uncertainty to reconstructions of room heights, doorways, and possible roof alignments. This erosion complicates attempts to determine whether the Great House once contained elevated viewing points intentionally positioned towards solar or lunar horizon events. While the broad horizon certainly allowed observation of celestial cycles, the site lacks clear architectural features designed for precise tracking, leading scholars to treat astronomical interpretations as plausible but unproven. The abundance of crushed pottery and evidence of repeated resurfacing of plaza floors suggest communal activities, but their nature remains elusive. Some layers indicate feasting, others everyday refuse, and still others a mix that hints at periodic intensification of use rather than constant occupation. The surrounding landscape adds further texture. To the north, the mesa undulates into a web of small canyons and ridges, places where isolated farming settlements have been identified, indicating that Pueblo Alto may have served as a gathering point for dispersed communities whose agricultural fields lay far from the canyon core. To the south, the view drops sharply into Chaco Canyon, its great houses arranged with an order that contrasts with the rugged terrain. And this juxtaposition underscores the deliberate decision to place Pueblo Alto not among those structures, but above them, creating a layered spatial arrangement that may reflect differing functions within the Chacoan system. Yet, contradictions persist. While the site's elevation suggests oversight or coordination, the artifacts recovered do not clearly support administrative control. While the middens indicate gatherings, they do not provide definitive clues about their frequency or scale. And while the road system converges near the mesa, the exact role Pueblo Alto played in that network remains only partially understood. Recent surveys using high-resolution mapping have illuminated subtle terraces, retaining walls and pathways around the Great House, features that suggest careful modification of the mesa surface to accommodate movement and repeated visitation. Still, the rooms themselves lack the density of domestic features typically associated with year-round residents, reinforcing the idea that Pueblo Alto may have been used intermittently, perhaps during specific cycles or events linked to agricultural, social, or ceremonial rhythms. Some researchers propose that the site functioned broadly as a gathering place where people from surrounding areas came together to reaffirm ties or redistribute goods, but the absence of inscriptions or overt ritual objects leaves such interpretations open-ended. Others consider that the site's elevated position may have held symbolic significance within the cultural landscape, its placement on high ground, creating a complementary relationship with the canyon floor great houses, though the meaning of such spatial hierarchies remains difficult to infer without direct testimony. What remains certain is that Pueblo Alto holds an interplay of clarity and ambiguity. Its architecture confirms its integration into the Chacoan world. Its middens attest to concentrated periods of activity. Its location ties it to regional roots and horizon lines. And yet, the purpose that once animated its rooms and plazas remains incomplete, shaped partly by what time has preserved, and partly by what has disappeared into wind and erosion. And as the Mesa continues to weather, and each new survey adjusts our understanding by small degrees, Pueblo Alto endures on its high perch, a structure defined as much by the open plains and distant mesas it overlooks as by its own masonry walls, holding its place within the broader mystery of how the Chacoan world organized its landscapes, gatherings, and intentions across the long sweep of the high desert. Mount Taylor Summit. High on the volcanic crown of Mount Taylor, where the mesa-like summit opens into broad, wind-scoured fields of basalt and cinder, the summit shrines lie scattered in modest yet unmistakable forms, their low stone rings, cairns and linear alignments arranged across the high plateau in patterns that seem almost accidental at first glance, only gradually revealing the quiet deliberation behind their placement as one walks among them and begins to sense the mountain's long role as a focal point in the cultural geography of the region. Rising more than 11,000 feet above the surrounding plains, Mount Taylor commands panoramic views that stretch for hundreds of miles, encompassing the distant Chacoan heartland to the northwest, the volcanic fields of the Jemez Mountains to the north, and the arid plateaus of western New Mexico fading into haze, a horizon so broad that the summit appears not merely elevated but central, a point from which the landscape gathers in every direction. The shrines themselves vary in form, some simple stone circles, others low cairns of stacked basalt cobbles, and still others elongated or horseshoe-shaped outlines that may once have framed offerings or marked specific horizon lines. But most are small and unobtrusive, suggesting individual or small group activities rather than large communal gatherings. Ethnographic accounts from several Pueblo communities refer to the mountain, known in Querés as Tzudziu, as a place of spiritual significance, one of the 4 sacred peaks that orient the world, though these oral traditions, while deeply meaningful, do not directly identify the origins or specific use of each archaeological feature scattered across the summit. Archaeological surveys confirm that many of the shrines predate European arrival, yet the lack of associated artifacts, hearths, or diagnostic ceramics makes precise dating difficult, leaving only the weathering of the stones and the context of regional cultural patterns to suggest their antiquity. The basalt surfaces, darkened by lichen and pitted by freeze-thaw cycles, show minimal disturbance around the shrines, reinforcing the idea that they functioned primarily as ritual stations rather than habitation sites. Some alignments appear to interact with distant landmarks. A few cairns frame views toward the Chusca Mountains, others toward volcanic necks rising sharply from the plains, and one linear arrangement points loosely toward Mount Taylor's own eroded outer slopes, though whether these sightlines carried cosmological or territorial significance remains uncertain. The summit's ecology adds to the interpretive challenge. Its harsh climate, frequent lightning, fierce winds and long winters limits organic preservation, and the scarcity of soil means that any small offerings of plant material or painted wood would have vanished quickly, leaving the shrines as stone-only signatures of activities that may have been richer and more varied in practice. The mountain's geology also complicates interpretation. Its summit is littered with naturally broken basalt fragments, and distinguishing intentional construction from natural rock, scatter requires careful attention to patterns of selection, placement, and orientation. Yet in many shrines, the stones are notably smaller and more uniform than the surrounding debris field, arranged in circles or arcs, whose symmetry suggests human agency, even when the forms appear modest. Some researchers propose that the summit may have served as a pilgrimage destination, with individuals ascending the mountain to leave small markers, offerings, or prayers aligned with personal or communal traditions. But the archaeological evidence remains light enough that such interpretations, while plausible, cannot be confirmed. Others consider the possibility that the shrines mark specific points connected to agricultural or seasonal cycles, using the mountain's high elevation as a vantage for observing changes in light, weather, or distant fields, though the lack of precise astronomical features, such as sighting frames or carved markers, moderates such claims. A few shrines cluster near natural breaks in the summit plateau, where views open toward particular horizon notches, and these placements raise the question of whether certain locations were chosen for the way sunrise or sunset interacted with the landscape at specific times of year. Yet none of the alignments are exact enough to assert formal observatory use. The absence of ceramics, lithics, or distinctive artifacts across most of the summit suggests brief, episodic visitation rather than sustained presence, consistent with practices in which the mountain itself held primary significance and the shrines served as touch points rather than destinations. Still, contradictions remain. Some shrines appear heavily weathered, implying great age, while others show sharper edges and more recent stone placement, suggesting that use may have continued or been renewed across centuries, leaving a palimpsest of intentions difficult to separate into distinct phases. The spread of shrines, from simple circles near the summit's edge to more elongated forms set around minor promontories, indicates a network of places rather than a single focal point. But whether this network reflects coordinated cultural practices or individual acts accumulated over time remains unresolved. In the early morning, when low clouds drift close to the summit, the shrines seem almost embedded in the fog, their stones glistening with condensation, and in such moments it becomes easier to imagine how the mountain's shifting weather patterns may have shaped experiences here, making visibility, sound, and light part of the ritual context, even if the stones alone do not record those sensory dimensions. Geological observations note that the summit plateau has remained relatively stable over millennia, with only minor erosion affecting the surface, meaning that many shrines may sit nearly where they were originally placed, lending weight to their subtle but persistent presence. Yet the mountain's cultural importance has shifted across time, and the possibility that different groups may have used the summit in different ways introduces further complexity. Some may have seen the shrines as territorial markers, others as ceremonial stations, and still others as personal offerings, and the overlapping traces of these uses form a quiet tapestry that resists single explanations. What endures most clearly is the relationship between the shrines and the mountain itself. The forms are small, the stones ordinary, yet their placement across the exposed plateau creates a pattern of purposeful presence on a summit where nothing accidental lasts long. And as new surveys map the features with increasing precision, each cairn and ring becomes part of a larger understanding, not of a single ritual system, but of many layered interactions with a peak that has drawn attention for centuries, leaving behind structures that hold their meanings lightly, shaped by human intention, but defined equally by the vastness of the surrounding sky. South Mountain. Along the long, undulating crest of South Mountain, overlooking the Salt River Valley in central Arizona, where desert heat wavers upward from granite outcrops and the ridge lines tilt toward a horizon softened by distance. The ancient ridge structures appear as low, stone outlines that blend almost seamlessly with the surrounding bedrock, their modest forms revealing themselves only when the shifting light isolates each wall from the natural scatter around it, suggesting a landscape shaped through quiet, persistent human presence rather than monumental construction. These structures, primarily low masonry enclosures, elongated walls, and occasional room-like rectangles built from locally sourced metamorphic stone, occupy vantage points that command sweeping views of the valley below, including distant agricultural fields that once lined the Salt and Gila rivers, and their placement echoes patterns found among Hohokam hilltop sites dating back nearly a millennium. Archaeological surveys show that some of these formations likely served as seasonal lookout points or temporary shelters, while others may have functioned as activity areas related to hunting, gathering, or ritual observance, but the sparse material record, few artifacts, limited midden deposits, and minimal evidence of long-term habitation, keeps the interpretations tentative. Many of the enclosures share a consistent orientation toward gaps in the surrounding hills, and some align loosely with points where the sun rises or sets at particular times of year, though the irregularity of the walls and the variability of their angles make it difficult to assert astronomical purpose with certainty. The stonework itself is modest. Small slabs gathered from the surrounding slopes, stacked without mortar, forming walls that rarely rise above knee height today, but may once have stood higher before centuries of weathering and intermittent disturbance. The geology of South Mountain, an eroded metamorphic core complex, produces fractured stone that breaks naturally into slab-like pieces, making it challenging to distinguish intentional placement from natural patterns, unless the stones appear in clustered or linear formations that stand apart from the broader debris field. Yet, within many of the ridge structures, the stones show a consistency in size and placement that suggests human agency, their alignment forming arcs or rectangles that deviate subtly but unmistakably from the unpredictable scatter of natural talus. Some researchers have proposed that these structures formed part of a broader network of elevated stations used by Hohokam communities to monitor weather, seasonal changes, or the movement of people across the valley floor, though direct evidence of signaling or systematic observation is limited. Others suggest that the ridge-top settings may have held ceremonial significance, providing places where individuals or small groups could engage with the expansive desert landscape in ways that complemented activities occurring in the larger platform mounds and canal-fed settlements below. The distribution of the structures, often appearing in clusters separated by long stretches of bare ridge, adds to the complexity, hinting at patterns of movement or usage that do not resolve easily into a single interpretive framework. Some clusters appear associated with minor saddles or slopes, where trails naturally ascend the mountain, suggesting nodes in a broader network of footpaths, while others sit on high points that offer views toward distant landmarks, including the Sierra Estrella and the White Tank Mountains. Archaeological testing has revealed occasional flakes of stone tools, fragments of pottery from the Hohokam Classic period, and small concentrations of charcoal. But these materials are sparse, reinforcing the idea that use was intermittent and task-specific rather than permanent. The absence of storage pits, hearth complexes, or substantial midden deposits further supports this view, though it also limits opportunities for direct dating, leaving the chronology of the ridge structures broad and somewhat indistinct. Environmental factors complicate matters. The exposed ridgelines experience extreme temperatures, intense summer monsoon runoff, and winter winds that can dislodge stones and erode shallow soils, contributing to the gradual degradation of the walls and making it difficult to determine their original height or configuration. Some walls curve subtly to follow the natural contours of the ridge, while others cut across slopes at deliberate angles, possibly indicating roles in directing movement, marking space, or framing views, though these roles remain speculative. A few enclosures appear positioned to overlook specific drainages where desert bighorn, sheep, or mule deer once travelled, raising the possibility that some structures supported hunting activities. But again, the archaeological evidence is minimal and does not allow firm conclusions. Ethnographic parallels among O'odham and other regional groups highlight the cultural significance of mountains as places of power, perspective, and connection, though these later traditions cannot be directly tied to the earlier Hohokam structures with confidence. Still, the ridge-top locations, relative seclusion, and broad views invite consideration of symbolic or ritual dimensions that may have complemented practical uses. Contradictions arise in the variability of form. Some structures are small and compact, others elongated and open-ended, and still others little more than arcs of stone, making it challenging to categorize them within a single architectural or functional type. The distribution patterns also complicate interpretation, as some ridges contain dozens of features, while others of similar prominence remain nearly bare, suggesting differences in local use or shifting cultural priorities across time. Modern mapping efforts using aerial imaging and ground-based surveys continue to document new features, expanding the known extent of ridge structures, but also underscoring the difficulty of distinguishing ancient alignments from more recent modifications, including historic mining activity or modern trail construction. What remains consistent is the impression that the structures form part of a broader landscape adaptation, one in which elevated positions provided vantage, orientation, and meaning within a desert world organized around cycles of water, light, and social interaction. Yet, for all the suggestive patterns, the evidence remains fragmentary, shaped by the limits of preservation and the muted signatures of brief, periodic use. In this interplay between clarity and ambiguity, the South Mountain Ridge structures endure as subtle records of human presence on high ground, their low walls and faint alignments interacting with the surrounding desert in ways that resist simple explanation. And as the mountain continues to erode under sun and wind, the structures retain their quiet resilience, offering a reminder that even the most modest stones, when placed with intention, can hold a long and thoughtful relationship with the landscapes they inhabit, leaving behind traces that invite interpretation but never fully surrender their story. Sleeping Ute Mountain. Across the sprawling massif of Sleeping Ute Mountain in southwestern Colorado, where the silhouette of the range settles into the unmistakable form of a reclining figure, the summit shrines and high ridge enclosures lie dispersed among weathered sandstone ledges and juniper-studded slopes. Their modest stone rings, cairns, and isolated alignments situated in places where the wind gathers and the horizon opens into long, unbroken distances that stretch toward the Four Corners region. The mountain's topography, steep volcanic intrusions, narrow ridgelines, and broad, flattened knolls, creates a sequence of elevated platforms that feel both sheltered and exposed, and the shrines appear in patterns that seem at first incidental, only slowly resolving into distributions that hint at intention shaped by spiritual or ceremonial engagement rather than daily habitation. Archaeological surveys, limited by the mountain's rugged terrain and the sparse material record, document a range of small features, circular stone outlines, no more than a few meters across, solitary cairns built from local sandstone or igneous cobbles, and occasional linear arrangements that follow natural contours before diverging slightly from them, introducing questions about the choices behind their placement. Most lack datable artifacts or associated domestic debris, suggesting episodic visitation rather than long-term occupation. And the mountain's significance in Ute oral traditions, while profound, does not directly identify the origins or specific uses of these particular archaeological traces, leaving a space where cultural memory and material evidence overlap only lightly. The geology of Sleeping Ute Mountain, composed of laccolithic intrusions uplifted millions of years ago, provides abundant loose stone, making it necessary to distinguish intentional construction from natural rock scatter by examining patterns of selection, shape, and alignment. And in many cases, the shrines exhibit a consistency of form that diverges subtly from natural accumulation. Some sit precisely on ridge crests, overlooking drainage basins, where seasonal flows once supported patches of vegetation, while others occupy small terraces just below summits, their positions suggesting a desire for seclusion with partial views rather than sweeping panoramas. A few cairns appear aligned toward prominent landmarks: Hesperus Mountain to the east, Shiprock rising sharply from the desert to the southwest, or Mesa Verde's escarpment to the north. But the alignments remain loose rather than exact, implying symbolic orientation rather than precise astronomical sighting. The mountain's prominence across the region would have made it a natural point of reference for multiple communities, and the shrines may represent a layered history of engagement by different groups across centuries, though the lack of diagnostic materials prevents tying specific features to distinct cultural phases with confidence. Some archaeologists propose that these high-elevation features could have served as stations associated with vision-seeking or personal reflection, practices known from various indigenous traditions across the broader region. Yet the evidence remains circumstantial, shaped by location rather than artifacts. Others consider the possibility that certain shrine clusters may have functioned as territorial markers or boundary indicators, placed at passes or junctions where traditional trails crossed the mountain's flanks. However, the placement of many features on less accessible ridges complicates this view, suggesting that practical considerations were not the only factors guiding their construction. Environmental conditions further challenge interpretation. The mountain endures strong winds, rapid temperature shifts, and frequent freeze-thaw cycles, all of which contribute to stone displacement over time, making it difficult to determine the original height or arrangement of many shrines. Some enclosures appear partially collapsed, their stones scattered downslope, while others remain remarkably intact, their low rings maintaining a coherence that implies careful placement initially and minimal disturbance afterward. The scarcity of organic remains on these exposed ridges prevents radiocarbon dating, and even lichenometric approaches face limitations due to variability in growth rates across the mountain's microclimates. Still, subtle clues emerge. A few shrines show interior levelling, as if the ground was intentionally smoothed, while others contain slightly larger stones at cardinal points or along their openings, features that may indicate directional emphasis or ritual organization. The relationship between the shrines and the mountain's distinctive profile adds another layer to the puzzle. Sleeping Ute Mountain, seen from the surrounding valleys, forms a reclining human figure with identifiable head, arms, torso and legs, a form that has played a role in oral traditions across the region. Whether ancient builders constructed shrines with reference to these features, or whether the mountain's anthropomorphic shape later informed interpretations of older structures, remains an open question. Some shrines cluster near the heart and forehead areas of the silhouette when viewed from the east, but the rugged terrain offers logistical explanations as well, with flat summit areas naturally attracting human presence regardless of symbolic associations. Trails leading to the shrines are faint or entirely absent today, though erosion and vegetation shifts may have obscured earlier paths. The absence of well-worn routes reinforces the idea of small-scale visitation rather than frequent pilgrimage. Yet contradictions persist. While most shrines appear isolated and individual, a few occur in small groups of 3 or more within short distances, suggesting coordinated use or sequential construction, though the lack of consistent spacing or form in these clusters complicates interpretation. Occasional finds, fragments of stone tools, a few scattered potsherds, or small concentrations of charcoal appear near some features, providing tantalizing but inconclusive evidence of activity that might include offerings, short-term campfires, or tool sharpening, but their sporadic distribution prevents defining a clear pattern. Geological vantage points add still more dimensions. From certain shrines, the sunrise aligns with distant mesas during key seasonal shifts, while from others, the sunset falls behind angular ridgelines in ways that create fleeting moments of illumination across the stone rings. Yet these effects are subtle and not universal across the mountain, leaving open the question of whether they were observed intentionally or are products of the landscape's natural interactions with light. Modern surveys continue to map the shrines with increasing precision, documenting their forms, positions, and relationships to topographic features. But the cumulative record, while rich in spatial detail, remains light on cultural context. What emerges instead is a landscape of recurring yet varied expressions, small stone rings, cairns of differing size, occasional linear alignments, each modest on its own, but collectively suggesting a long-term pattern of interaction with a mountain that has held meaning across generations. And in this interplay of architectural subtlety, environmental change, and cultural continuity, the sleeping Ute Mountain shrines remain anchored to the ridgelines and summit flats, carrying a quiet weight that endures not through monumental presence, but through the persistence of intention expressed in stone, leaving a record that is neither explicit nor silent, poised at the threshold where evidence gestures toward meaning, without fully revealing the practices that once shaped it. Cedar Mesa Ridge. Across the rugged expanse of Cedar Mesa in southeastern Utah, where deep sandstone canyons divide broad, juniper-dotted uplands into a patchwork of plateaus and narrow ridgelines, the ridge shrines appear in modest but deliberate forms. Small stone circles, low cairns, and carefully arranged alignments perched along the broken edges of cliffs and promontories, often in places where the land falls sharply away into the serpentine shadows of Grand Gulch, or the wider tributaries that feed the San Juan River. Their construction, subtle enough to blend into the mesa's sandstone debris, yet distinct in the regularity of their shapes, suggests a long sequence of human engagements shaped by the rhythms of movement, observation, and ceremony rather than by habitation. For the ridges hold few artifacts beyond the occasional flake or potsherd, left by travellers who pass through these high points without lingering long. Cedar Mesa's geology, perched atop layers of ancient sand dunes hardened into cross-bedded cliffs, creates vantage points where sightlines extend for tens of miles, and many shrines appear positioned where these views open dramatically toward the Bear's Ears, the Abajo Mountains, Combe Ridge, or Monument Valley, though the exact purpose of these orientations remains uncertain. Some shrines sit just inches from sheer drop-offs, their stones arranged in careful arcs, as if framing the void below, while others cluster near natural breaks in the plateau, where narrow ridges funnel movement across the mesa, hinting at roles that may have combined wayfinding, ritual practice, or personal reflection. Archaeological surveys, though extensive in the canyons below, have only lightly sampled the mesa top, leaving many features recorded but not excavated, their dates inferred primarily through context rather than direct evidence. The scarcity of ceramics at most shrine sites suggests periodic use rather than continuous occupation, possibly spanning multiple cultural phases from basket maker times through later Pueblo periods, though without diagnostic materials, the temporal boundaries remain blurred. Some stone circles appear weathered and partially collapsed, their outer edges softened by centuries of wind-driven sand, while others are sharper and more intact, raising the possibility of repeated or renewed use across generations. A few shrines contain interior leveling or slightly raised central points made of smaller stones, features that have prompted comparisons to Mesa top offering stations elsewhere in the region. Though without organic remains or preserved offerings, such interpretations remain suggestive rather than demonstrable. The Mesa's cultural landscape adds another layer of complexity. Just below many ridge shrines lie alcoves containing cliff dwellings, granaries, and rock art panels, forming a vertical sequence of habitation, storage, and symbolic expression that may have connected the high places with daily life in ways no longer fully recoverable. Some researchers propose that the ridge shrines served as lookout points tied to agricultural cycles, where individuals could observe incoming weather systems, assess water availability in the canyons, or monitor seasonal transitions by watching sunrises and sunsets across distinctive horizon notches. However, the irregularity of shrine alignments limits the certainty of such interpretations. Others suggest that the shrines may have been stages in longer ritual circuits, with participants ascending from canyon dwellings to ridge-top locations for specific ceremonies, though the sparse material record makes it difficult to anchor this idea in archaeological data. Ethnographic perspectives from descendant communities emphasize the significance of high places and the enduring presence of offerings left at ridgeline locations. Yet these accounts, while valuable, cannot be mapped directly onto the ancient features without overextending the evidence. Geological processes further complicate matters. The ridges experience strong winds, monsoon storms, and winter freeze-thaw cycles that gradually shift stones downslope and erode shallow soils, making it challenging to determine the original height or completeness of many shrines. Some cairns appear to have slumped, their top layers missing, while others remain tightly stacked, suggesting that preservation varies depending on exposure and underlying bedrock. One of the more intriguing observations is that several shrines align loosely with long-established travel corridors that cross Cedar Mesa, particularly routes connecting water sources and canyon entrances, implying that the shrines may have served as markers of transition or points of pause along these ancient paths. Yet other shrines stand apart from any obvious route, situated instead on isolated ridges that require deliberate deviation to reach, suggesting purposes oriented more toward contemplation or ceremony than navigation. The interplay of accessibility and seclusion across the shrine locations resists simple categorization. Some appear integrated into the landscape's natural flow, while others seem intentionally removed from it. Occasional finds, a fragment of a projectile point, a small scatter of lithics, or a lone potsherd, provide hints of activity, but not enough to define consistent patterns. Even lichen growth, sometimes used to estimate relative age, varies widely due to microclimatic differences across the mesa, limiting its usefulness as a chronological tool. Modern mapping techniques, including high-resolution aerial imagery and GPS surveys, have begun to reveal the full extent of shrine distribution, showing that many ridges once thought empty contain subtle features whose stones blend so closely with the surrounding landscape that only careful ground inspection makes them visible. This growing inventory suggests that the practice of constructing ridgetop shrines may have been more widespread than previously recognized, contributing to a broader understanding of Cedar Mesa as a layered cultural landscape where living spaces, storage sites, agricultural fields, travel routes, and ceremonial points coexisted across vertical and horizontal dimensions. Yet, for all this expanding detail, the essential questions remain open. Whether the shrines served primarily personal, communal, symbolic, or observational roles, whether their orientations carried specific meaning or emerged from local landscape familiarity. and whether their distribution reflects a coherent tradition or a mosaic of practices spanning centuries. In this mixture of evidence and silence, the ridge shrines of Cedar Mesa continue to hold their place along the sandstone edges, shaped by human intention yet softened by wind and time, offering glimpses of how ancient peoples engaged with the high country, but withholding any definitive narrative, allowing their stones to remain part of the Mesa's ongoing dialogue between landscape, memory, and the enduring presence of subtle human traces.